Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope blog and podcast. I'm speaking today with Nomi Harper. Her mom was actually a survivor of Auschwitz who was on Block 10 in the extermination quarter of um, the building. And her mom actually had experienced, well, not Nomi will talk about it more, but attempted sterilization during their sterilization experiments. And um, I found Nomi and really wanted to talk with her. Her mom has passed away. Renee was her name. She's passed away. Um, but Nomi just remembers that time with her mom very vividly and knows her story well and has told it a few times. And so I asked her to come on the podcast and talk about it. As I always think that the Holocaust, as well as instances of genocide, are important to talk about and to remember. Um, Nomi, I want to ask you, kind of to start off, what's your fondest memory of being with your mom growing up?
Her adventure. She was very adventurous and she uh, loved life and she was very bold and nothing really frightened her. She did anything and everything she wanted to with me. She gave me a wonderful life in a lot of ways. She always took us, just the two of us, on weekend trips to the mountains or to Marin or to go swimming or to the beach. And she just was really adventurous. So, and her strength, just extremely courageous.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. But I wanted to say something. You mentioned in the beginning, you said something about extermination camp.
I know.
My
Yes, thank you for saying that. Go ahead.
she was in the experimental block,
Yes,
which was
thank you.
called, yeah, that was called Block 10, which was the experimental block. And when she arrived in Auschwitz, she was a newlywed with her husband, her mother, her father, and her father-in-law and mother-in-law. They all had been deported at the same time from Amsterdam. But when she arrived, um, she was told, I think it was to go to the left, like left. I always thought of left meant life. And when she found out, Dr. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, picked her out, and she found out later when she was in Block 10 that she should be lucky. She's lucky. She should be grateful because now she's in the experiment block, which means that they will keep her alive.
Okay.
So yeah, and her parents actually didn't arrive in Auschwitz with her. I just realized they went to Bergen-Belsen, and the
Okay.
same with her mother-in-law and father-in-law. And then eventually her mother and father went to Theresienstadt. Are you aware of Theresienstadt and what kind of a camp that was?
No, I know it's another concentration camp, but
So Theresienstadt was more for artists or um, people in, with a high, the more elite. And it was also, yes, it was a concentration camp, but it was a facade
yeah.
that, and they were promised that they would not be, killed. But in the end, in 1944, September, October, each one of them, first my grandfather, then my grandmother, each were taken from Theresienstadt and on a train to Auschwitz and then immediately gassed in Auschwitz, and a month apart. So the promise was a lie. There
What
were very
about,
important. Yeah,
oh,
go
I was
ahead.
gonna say, what about her husband that you mentioned at the beginning too?
Sadly, Fritz Kramer, which was her first husband and the love of her life, he was killed in Auschwitz shortly after they
Okay.
arrived. Yeah.
Did she find out about that soon after arriving as well, or did it take a while for her to know that happened?
Um, my cats are having an argument. I don't. I don't think she knew when she was in Auschwitz.
Okay.
that he had died. But that's a good question. I probably have forgotten that. As I have gotten older, things haven't are not as clear anymore. But yeah. And she
What,
found out after the war as well that her parents had died in Auschwitz. I mean, I do know that. Anyway, yes.
what was it when she would describe it to you? How would she talk about it? Did she tell you about it relatively young, or did she wait a while to share
Uh-huh.
with you?
She did tell me very young. I was very young. I was 6, 5 years old, and she would tell me about her experiences. And she and I were like the two musketeers instead of the three. We were each other's support system.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, after the war, um, liberators as well as survivors were invalidated. They weren't believed. People couldn't believe the atrocities that they heard from the
Yeah.
liberators and from the survivors. And eventually, my mother stopped talking about it to a lot of people. She just, it, I don't remember her talking about it very much uh,
Hmm.
to others as much as she did after uh, the early 70s when the miniseries, The Holocaust, came out with
Hmm.
Meryl Streep. And that was like a worldwide event. When that aired on television, people stopped everything to watch it over many nights. And
Wow.
that was the catalyst that informed the German youth in school what their ancestors had done. They were not educated. This part of history was not in the textbooks.
Hmm.
So at that point, it was like open season to talk about it. And
Hmm.
that's when she
Okay.
became more vocal about it. Yeah. But
But she
I always
told
knew.
you. Yeah, you knew pretty
Yeah.
young. What was that first conversation like?
I don't remember the first conversation. I do remember the impact it had on me. I woke up from a nightmare and I was so frightened, and I know that, I mean, the dream is very vivid. I can still recall it. My mother and I were in a Jeep in the war, and we were in the back of a Jeep, the two of us, with a Nazi soldier driving. And he came across a curve and he turned really sharply, and we both tumbled out of the Jeep and we fell into these barrels. And I remember popping myself up looking for my mother, and she wasn't anywhere. And then I got terrified and I woke up. I couldn't take it anymore.
Hmm.
So that trauma of being abandoned, I think, started there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did she describe her time in Auschwitz? What do you remember her saying about it?
Well, she actually had a positive attitude about a lot of things.
Hmm.
When she talked about it, it wasn't like she was trying to instill fear in me. She would talk about being fortunate that she could go outside and pick leaves, and which was something she very much looked forward to because it took her out of the camp. But the experiments were horrible. Um, so Dr. Klauberg was the doctor that did the experiment with injections. Not all women had injections. Um, some of them had physically were their ovaries were removed without anesthesia,
Wow.
and they would die. And they were all young women. Probably some of them, and probably all of them, probably hadn't had even sexual relations yet. And um, my mom, what was I going to tell you?
But you were
Uh,
describing it to me, what she said about the
so she was
sterilization.
she was in extreme pain when they did these, when they would inject a kind of an agent in her fallopian tube, which basically clogged her fallopian tube.
Yeah.
And uh, Dr. Benjamin, oh my God, I don't want to tell you what's going on, but my cat just came with a present for me and he's out there. Um, um, my mom was lucky because the doctor that was also a Jew, and he was a hero because he did everything he could do to sabotage another extermination of the other ovary. He tried with, and that's why I'm here, because of him. Um,
And this is a separate doctor from Dr. Clawberg that you're talking about, right?
yes, yes. Dr. Samuel, I think was his name. It could have been Dr. Benjamin Samuel, but I should have checked first. I didn't know we were going to talk about this. What he would do is he'd deliberately find excuses to not do the experiment, the second one, for example, because he wanted to save one ovary in these women.
And he was
With
an assistant too?
he was an actual doctor but he was a prisoner, and he was
Okay.
assigned in the block 10.
Okay.
So, like one time my mother told me that there were 7 women waiting to have another injection. And he said, well, there's only 7 women. I refuse to do this. There has to be 10. And
Hmm.
he was trying to save these women.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And that, the pain was horrible, because there was no anesthesia,
Yeah.
and it was debilitating, but she was very determined to live, and she did.
Did
She
she
did get
know? I was gonna say, did she know that the experiments were sterilization experiments or no?
I think she did.
Hmm.
I think that I think she did. I mean, it's not like something, I don't think it was something she found out later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And their whole mission was to annihilate the Jews, to just, prevent them from procreating.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
How did she survive, your mom?
Well, good question. At the end of the war, in January of 1945, the Nazis knew they were losing, and the Russians were coming to liberate the camps. And the Russians knew that. And what they were doing at that point was they created this idea that whoever that was still alive in Auschwitz, they were just going to put them on a death march and make them walk, and in the snow. And it's very severe cold. And some prisoners had no shoes. And so what's your question? How did she survive? Because I know
Yeah.
there's so much to lead up to it. Um, so um, she was on 3 death marches.
Wow.
And so, each one of these death marches, they just walked until they were allowed to stop. And if anybody stopped, they were shot. And the backs of their jackets or any kind of coat that they had a target on it, so that if they were out of line, a Nazi would just shoot the target.
Mm.
And my mom was really smart, and she knew how to. She was a great sewer. She was a professional. Her tante Lena, who went to Bergen-Belsen and died there, she's the one that my mother took sewing lessons with in
Mm.
Amsterdam for 3 years. So my mom was an excellent sewer, and she managed to be able to. I guess she had a needle and thread somewhere like in the lining of her coat. And I don't know if she did this while she was on the death march, but she managed to create a way to fold in the target, the
Wow.
X,
Yeah.
into the coat. So when the war was over, she could hide it so nobody would know that she had
Mm,
been a prisoner. Anyway, when she, there were many times on these death marches that she told me stories about her experiences. Um, there was a man, Otto Gerber. He was also a prisoner. He had been a thief. And so when the Nazis, when he was inherited, an inherited prisoner, he came as a prisoner to Auschwitz, but he had clout. He was an artist, and
mm,
the Nazis used him to not. They used him to make sketches and paint or whatever of the Nazis. But he was
mm.
also, he had the ability to help my mom get out of Block 10 eventually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he eventually asked her, "Do you have any other skills? What can you do?" She said, "Yeah, I can write music, play piano, I can sew." So he said, "Good, I'm going to put you in Block 1, where they had the orchestra. There was an orchestra in Auschwitz." And so she wrote the music for each instrument, and she
Mm,
sewed the curtains in Block 1. Eventually, though, they went on these death marches when the Nazis knew that that they were going to be, everything was going to be exposed. I mean, literature, all documents were burned.
wow.
And I know this because Laura Shelley was the secretary, and my mother and her became friends after the war. I don't know how they found each other, but she lived in San Francisco. And Laura Shelley wrote a lot of books. Her name, Lore. And that's another woman that was an incredible um, resource of information, because
And
she was
you,
privy to all the documents and how
okay.
things, how they calculated things. It's just amazing. IBM was part of, um, they were part of helping the Nazis keep track of all the prisoners as well.
Hmm.
So anyway, um, so my mom was on 3 death marches, and she met this. Okay, so Otto Gerber got her out of Block 10 into Block 1, and he also
Yeah.
told her, if you ever, at the end of the war, you can go to my mother's house in Dresden, and she will give you shelter.
Mm,
Don't, just let her know that you know who I am and the affiliation, and she will let you stay with her. So after, on these death marches, which now takes place over January, February, March, April, April. So February, March, April, I guess 3 months.
of
She's walking.
1945.
Yeah, she's
Wow. Okay.
walking, and they walked 5 prisoners, in a row,
Yeah.
and there were 5 prisoners. Um, you know what? I have to show you something. I'm
Yeah,
gonna
go
go
ahead.
get her. I'm gonna leave for a second. I'll be right back.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. And viewers, for those listening,
I'm sorry. What'd you say?
oh no, you're good. I'm just letting the viewers know that you're grabbing.
Yeah. All right.
There
So
it
this
is.
is this is a sketchbook that my mom wrote. Can you read it, or is
Yeah, I
it
can. It's very
okay? So
good.
it's not mirror. I mean, it's not backwards. So
No.
it says why, what, where happened to Renee, and how.
Hmm.
And what I was just describing to you, turn right to the page. Okay. So this is a
Wow.
this is a sketch that she did. I think it was 1987 or 1985.
Hmm.
And she did all these sketches in one night. There's like
Wow.
45 of them. And so I told you that there were 5 prisoners right next to each other. So she's like giving you a visual, and that's her. And at this point, she's in Dresden, and she knows that this is where Otto told her that his mother lives. And
Yeah.
she was kind of at the end of the line, but it doesn't look like it. But what she did was, when nobody was looking, she took a chance, and she just slipped into a courtyard
Wow.
with an open kind of door, but it's a courtyard. And that's where she went, and she waited for all the prisoners to pass. And this was April 15th, 1945 at 9 a.m. She wrote down everything she remembered, and she remembered all kinds of details. She
Wow.
was incredible. She was really an incredible person. That's where she stayed. And there was a man that was in the courtyard. He was a Nazi, and he was brushing his horse, and they both sort of just acknowledged each other but didn't really interact. And he kind of just like, it's the end of the war, they knew they were losing, and I don't think, each one of them wanted the war to end.
Yeah.
So, like, let each other live.
Hmm.
So they did. And so my
Wow.
mother found, she had the address in her head, and in her memory. And one of the things that happened to her on the death march before she was here in Dresden was, during this 3-month period, she remembered she had forgotten the address because nothing was written down. And she was so sad that she couldn't remember the address, but she overheard some other prisoners, some other women talking, and they were talking about the same place, going to the same place. And they
Oh, wow.
said the address. So then my mom got it again.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
really neat.
Yeah. And so there she was, and she got to Otto Gerber's mother's house eventually. Maybe it took a few moments, few hours or days, but um, she did. She was allowed to stay there, but the mother um, didn't know that she was a prisoner, had been a prisoner.
Huh.
Yeah, but that's how it happened, though. So she's now safe, and then she started her way back to Amsterdam. That's where they had been living. Her and her husband, her parents lived in an apartment, and she lived with her her husband and her in-laws in another apartment in Amsterdam. They're not far from each other, maybe a matter of, I don't know, a few blocks. And that's where they had been staying. My uncle, her brother Rudy, was already in America because he was fortunate enough to get out with his father, who brought him to America, to New York. And the plan was for him to go back and get the rest of the family. But when he did go back, it wasn't possible anymore for Jews to leave.
Hmm.
And yeah,
And that's how he died too. Her dad, right?
the parents both were taken to Bergen-Belsen on the transport train. When
Hmm.
they were taken from Amsterdam, they were rounded up, and all 6 of them were rounded up in in a and they were taken to the Schouwberg, which was a theater in Amsterdam. I was there with my sons in 2020, and I was actually in the physical place of the Schouwberg. That
Hmm.
was a special theater in Amsterdam, and kitty corner from it was the zoo, and right next to the zoo was the train tracks of the cars that took them to Auschwitz or to
Hmm.
Bergen-Belsen or to, yeah, and that's where and I think though that they first went to not Theresienstadt, what was the other one? My memory. It was a holding camp. I can't think of it right now, but
But did her parents die eventually
they
or
were
no?
killed in
Okay.
Auschwitz in
Okay.
1944 at the end of the war, at the end of 1944.
Okay. So for her, when you're saying she returned back to Amsterdam
After the war.
after the war, did she expect to find anyone at home?
Well, on her way back from Dresden, it took her maybe 6 months to get back. She investigated and went to Theresienstadt, where her parents were, where she believed her parents were last seen and had been. And there she found out that her parents had been transported at the end of 1944 to Auschwitz. And that's when she found out they died. And that's when she broke down and cried.
Hmm.
Because her parents always thought that she was frail, that she wouldn't survive the war.
Hmm.
And then she had survived the war, and it was a very traumatic experience for her to know that her parents didn't survive, and yet and she had survived. It was very painful.
What about when did she find out her husband had died?
Don't know. When she
Hmm.
got back
Okay.
to Amsterdam, I think what happened was when she went back to Amsterdam, she put an ad in the newspaper. Have you seen Fritz Kramer? He was born on this day, and I'm looking for him. And I don't know how she found out or exactly when she found out, but after the war, life was very hard and chaotic, and how to find answers. So it
Oh
took a
yeah.
while, I'm sure, but I don't, I never really asked her, I think, how how she learned that he died.
Did she talk a lot about him when you were born? About her first husband?
Yeah, she loved him
Hmm.
so much. She adored him. Yeah, they met in Amsterdam when my mother went in 1935, I think it was. And or let's see, my mom's born in 21. I think she was either 13 or 14 when it got so dangerous, and it was better for her to get out of Cologne, which is where she was born. And so she went with her tante Lena and lived in Amsterdam and learned how to sew. And that's where she met Fritz, because he was the son of one of the clients. And in those
Oh wow.
days, yeah, and in those days, um, as a sewer, you would go to the client's house and you would sew there in their home. So
Hmm.
that's what she, there, and they, got into a friendship, and eventually they decided to be married. But they got married very, so she was, probably, uh I don't know, maybe she was 17 or 15 when she met him. I'm not 100% sure,
Okay.
but yeah.
So they got
Then
married pretty young.
well, no, I mean in her 20s. I think she
Okay.
was yeah. So in 43, when they were taken to Auschwitz, her and Fritz, she was 20, she was 22. And I think they were married less than a year at
Wow.
that point.
What um and she when she because I remember hearing some of this from her. Nomi's mom was actually featured in a documentary, which we, if you've been listening to the podcast, listeners, you actually, Sonia Winterberg talked on the podcast a few weeks ago, and she was actually the director and the journalist behind that documentary. But I remember in the documentary mentioned that your mom didn't think she could have children after she escaped, right? She didn't think at all she could have any.
Right. She didn't.
So when
I have the
she,
documentary. Let me go get the documentary.
oh
I
yeah,
want to show
sure.
it to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just it's called here. This is
Made
it.
in Auschwitz. Yeah.
Yeah. Made in Auschwitz. The untold story of Block 10. They don't, yeah, the untold story of Block 10 is here. Yeah. The
What
filmmakers
did,
just sent me that.
yeah. What did you, I was gonna ask you, when did she kind of tell us the story about how you were born, kind of how that came about?
Okay. So after she found out that Fritz died or been murdered, And it was relatively early in the time, from the time that they got to um, to Auschwitz, because he didn't have as much of a will to live. He had told her already when they were in the transport train going to Auschwitz, he didn't think he would live. And she told him, keep your head up, think positive. But if that's how you feel, you know, you you bring about what you think about. And
Yeah. Hmm.
she had the will to survive. Um, so uh, help me get back on track.
Oh, you're
Um,
talking about how you were born.
okay. So she met her second husband, Yehuda Engel, and he was in the Jewish Brigade. When she got back to Amsterdam,
Hmm.
um, I don't know how soon she met him, but she reunited with her sister as well, who was in 17 different safe houses, my Aunt Ellen, who I adored and loved her so much. And she just passed away April last year.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
So she
Um,
actually, when you're saying safe houses, she never ended up getting caught or taken.
correct. But
Wow.
she came close to being caught because of a situation she put herself into.
Yeah.
She wanted to go back from one of the safe houses. She wanted to go back to Amsterdam to be with her parents. And at that very moment, there was a roundup in
Oh, wow.
Amsterdam, which which imprisoned the family. And she saw the Nazis everywhere, and she thought, oh my goodness, I have to leave, I have to get out of here. So she managed to get back on the train and go back to one of the safe houses, and
Wow.
so
Okay.
she survived. But the reason that she came out of the safe house is because her mother, my grandmother, whom of course I never met, Esther Duering, um, wanted to see her daughter. She wanted
Yeah.
to see her, and Ellen was only like 17 at the
Yeah.
time, really
Hmm.
young. So, um, so
So your
how I
mom,
was,
yeah, you said your mom met her
yeah,
second
Yehuda.
husband in the Jewish
And
brigade.
he was a soldier in the Jewish brigade. And this is a very fascinating part of history too, if your listeners are interested. The Jewish brigade were a group of Jewish men who lived in Palestine before the state of Israel became a state in 1948. So they very much wanted to fight in the British Army, but they couldn't fight. They were allowed to learn to train, but they weren't allowed to be a part of the British Army. And they formed their own brigade that they called the Jewish Brigade.
Hmm.
And their mission was to enter into Europe, into Italy, and infiltrate. And their mission was to find any Nazis and kill them, and find any Jews and bring them back to Palestine. And
Hmm.
this was who he was. And my mother met him, and she said she was on the street and she saw that he had a Jewish star on his uniform, and she said shalom. And he turned, because it was very unusual for a woman to have survived after the war, my mom told me. And so he was very, he wanted to know who was talking to him. Shalom. And that's how they met. And he was a short, very well built, strong man. But he and my mother, got married in Amsterdam, and then the plan had changed. I know this is a long story, but there's a lot to every question. So
Oh
if
no,
I
you're
go
good.
if I go too much on a thing, you just got to tell me. Um, but the plan was for my sister and my mother to come to America, and their brother and his wife sponsored were to sponsor them both, and they were supposed to go together. But
Yeah.
now my mother had met Yehuda, and the plan changed. And so Ellen had to go by herself, and, which made her unhappy. But my mother decided she wanted to be with Yehuda and go to Israel. Well, it wasn't Israel, go to Palestine. And she had been a Zionist all her life, meaning she believed in the creation of a land, for the Jews.
Yeah.
And she decided that she was going to go there now to Israel. Well, I'm going to say Israel, but I mean Palestine,
Yeah.
because it wasn't Israel yet. And that's what happened. So they went to Palestine, and and well, they got married in Amsterdam. And I remember seeing a picture of my aunt and my mom with Yehuda after they got married, and two other people that were instrumental in my aunt finding a safe house. His name was Mr. Hamburger.
Hmm.
Yeah. So so that's what happened. They went to okay. How I was born. So what happened was, and now my mother lived in Israel, became a state eventually in 1948.
Yeah.
But and she lived there 10 years.
Wow.
And in 1956, my mother and I left, and we went to Germany. So what happened was, she very much wanted a child, and she approached Yehuda and said, let's adopt a child, because she did not think she had any ability to have a child.
Yeah.
And so she filled out the adoption papers, but when she gave the adoption papers for him to fill out his portion, she wondered why she never heard anything and back from the adoption agency. So she found out that he didn't mail the papers.
Oh.
And she went to the doctors in Haifa. They had a practice in basically a 3-room house that eventually became the hospital that I was born in, because it was built. But at that time, in 1950, I was born in 54, so this would have been in 53. And so the doctors said, well, you can have artificial insemination. And she said, well, who would be the father? They said, well, any one of us 3 doctors. And she said, that doesn't work for me. I'm going to pick out the father.
So
And
her husband didn't want kids at all?
so that was the part I forgot to tell you. She learned that he was sterile. I guess, they had examined him and however they
Okay.
find out. And then she found out that she actually could have a child. The doctor said that she had one good ovary, and that made her really excited and very happy. And so they had suggested, the doctors, that she be artificially inseminated, and because the adoption didn't go through. So that was the first attempt, adoption. The second one was artificial insemination. The third attempt was, now she finds out that she has one good ovary and that it was her husband who was sterile. And if she could have a child, she wanted to pick the father. So my mother and Yehuda had a restaurant called Cafe Renee. And it was like, when I was there in 2020, it was no longer standing, but it had a reputation. This place was like the place to go
Wow.
in Kiryat Atta. Um, uh, so, and Kiryat Atta was about a 35-40 minute drive, an hour maybe in those days, to Haifa, to go to Haifa from that town. It was a village, is what it
Yeah.
was. It was a village. And and uh my mother and Yehuda had this restaurant. Well, when she found out that she could conceive, and my father, my actual biological father, he came into the cafe, and she spotted him, and she asked him if he would do her a favor. She wanted to have a child. She wanted to pick the man, and she didn't expect anything from him, no monetary support or anything. And would he help her? He was one of 9 kids and the only male. So he did something by saying yes. That was very profound. And, I think first of all, he told my mother, he asked her right away, he said, "Are you happy?" And she said, "Yes." And when they first met, and he said, "Your husband is not being faithful to you." And she said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Well, he's riding around on his motorcycle with another woman." And eventually that's what happened. He divorced my mother. And she was already 6 months pregnant. And the rabbi, which is who performs a divorce, never asked my mother any questions at all, because women didn't have a voice. And so, yeah, so she got
But
divorced.
I was gonna say, when he told her, this man that walked into the restaurant, that he had seen her husband being unfaithful,
Mhm.
that was after
that
she
was
had asked
the
him?
that was the
No.
beginning.
Okay.
That was the start of it.
So
The
that's how they
start of the
met.
conversation. Yes, that's how they
Okay.
met. And so she thought about him. He's good looking, and I think I'd like to have a child with him. And she just asked him,
Hmm.
and he said, "Yeah, okay, I'll help you."
So she
Now,
did know him. He was not a complete stranger.
up until that point, he was a stranger.
That's
He
true, but I guess I mean when he first came into the restaurant and he talked with her and said that your husband is being unfaithful.
he was a
And then,
stranger at that point.
okay. And did
Yeah.
she ask him like the same day kind of thing, or was it
I
later?
don't know. I think it was either this, closely after, maybe
Okay.
shortly after. I mean, she probably had to think about it, but it was spontaneous too. She was that way. She was bold, really forward thinking woman. In 1953, to ask somebody that is very bold. And, she made her own rules. She was not in the effect side of other people's lives and
Yeah.
decisions. She made her own path. That is like the the amazing part about my mother, that she was a trailblazer for her time.
Hmm. How does it feel for you? Like, did you ever get to meet this man who's your actual biological father?
I did in 1985. That's an interesting story, because as I was growing up, my mother told me various versions of the truth. She didn't tell me right away what happened, and that, my mother and my father had, how she got pregnant. First, she told me she'd been artificially inseminated. Now, either she told me that, or it was the way my mind processed the information. I was probably 6 years old,
Yeah.
or younger, because I came home, and I remember she told me that when I told her that kids were asking me, "Where's your father?" And I told them that he died in the gas chamber, because that's what I thought. I was probably thinking about her first husband who died in the gas chamber. Didn't realize that he wasn't my father.
Right.
And she said, "No, no, no, no. That isn't what happened. I was artificially inseminated." So she corrected me with a story again, because she
Yeah.
wasn't artificially inseminated. But that was enough for me. I mean, that was enough for what I guess I could handle. But when I was 16, I'd already had a lot of questions.
Hmm.
And I sat her down. We sat down on the rug in her bedroom, and I said, "Okay, Mom, I want you to come clean and tell me now, really, truthfully, exactly what happened. How was I conceived? Were you artificially inseminated, or did you have relations with my father?" I didn't know who my father was. His name was Joseph, Nachum. I'm losing my mind. As I'm getting older, these words and these names do not come into my head as quickly as they used to. It's quite an awakening. So, yeah, get ready for the age thing going on. Be a long way to go before that happens to you. But yeah, anyway, yeah. So Joseph Nahum. And so then she told me, she said, no, we actually, I really wanted to know if they loved each other. That was important to me. I didn't want to just be an arrangement, which is what she told me all my life. You were just an arrangement. He doesn't want anything to do with you. Just be happy you're alive. And I said, yeah, I'd like to know if there was love between the two of you. And she finally told me that there was, and that it wasn't artificial insemination, and that they went to a field under the eucalyptus trees and made love. And she conceived right away. And he came back 3 something or 5 weeks later, and he said, do you want to try again? Maybe you want to try again just to make sure. And I think they did, but she already felt that, it wasn't necessary. But yeah. And then after, she conceived and she got pregnant, and she was 6 months pregnant. Yehuda decided he wanted to divorce her. I was born in the hospital in Haifa. He came to the hospital and put his name, Yehuda, not my father. He put his name on my birth certificate as a father. And my mother was furious. She said, you're not the father. What are you doing? And she said, I'm trying to help you. And but it has not helped, because my real father was another man. And
Yeah.
and when my mother I think it was in 1999 or 2000, my mother went back to Israel and wanted to correct those records. And the only person that knew, the witness that of who the three people are, my mother, Yehuda, and my father, Joseph, she wouldn't write anything down or testify that my father was my real father, not Yehuda. She wouldn't do that for my mother. For some reason, she was mad at my mother. And she was the woman that drove my mother when she was pregnant to Haifa. I was 2 weeks late. And so I gave birth. I mean, she gave birth in Haifa. Yeah.
So, did you, after she told you the truth about it, did you like form a closer connection to your real dad, or?
That did not happen until 1985, when I was already 31.
Oh
In
wow, okay.
1985, there was a gathering of the American gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors in Philadelphia, and I went with my mother. It was probably the second gathering of Holocaust survivors, and so my mother and I went to Philadelphia for 3 days. It was a fascinating, fascinating event. I met Jan Karski. This is another man. I will go get the book if you want me to, but Jan Karski, Jan Karski, Karski. He was uh, a Polish spy in the underground
Wow.
during the war. His mission was to find out what was going on in Auschwitz. He went to Auschwitz, he infiltrated, and he escaped. What he saw, he tried to tell. When he told Winston Churchill, he told Roosevelt, and nobody believed. Well, maybe they believed him, but they didn't do anything. We did not enter the war until, of course, Pearl Harbor, because
Right.
there wasn't a consensus in the United States to get involved to help the Jews. And yet he was a witness to what was going on. And he was telling heads of state, the president and the prime minister of England, what was going on. And he managed to get to England and to the United States and have an audience with both. And to tell them, please help, you know.
Yeah.
And
So you
but
met
young,
him
I
at the
met
gathering.
him. Yes, he talked, he spoke at the gathering, and he spoke as if he was a human tape recorder. He was already probably in his 80s, and he needed a
Wow.
walker. Yeah, and I think he either had a walker or he was wheeled in a wheelchair with a nurse, but he spoke for like a half an hour, and it was fascinating. And that changed my whole life. That experience. Barbara Walters was there. There was oh God, I forgot his name. He was a senator of Philadelphia, of Pennsylvania. He was famous. Who else did I meet? Elie Wiesel? I'm not sure, but
But you
that's when I
said you met your
learned.
dad there.
No, 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 no. It was because of this gathering that my curiosity became very piqued. And I really, really wanted to talk to him, meet him, thank him for giving me life, for doing all that. Because what he went through was, it was not socially acceptable. And
Yeah.
I don't think he had a really good reputation with his family after that. I mean, I'm sure he did, but they didn't like what he was doing.
Hmm.
That he had a child. You know what though? When I met him in 1985, I wrote him a letter. That's another story. But when I did finally meet him and talk to him, it was at this point in 1985 that everyone in the family learned who I was. He had not told anyone about me. Only his mother knew. But I did not know that I had 33 first cousins.
Wow.
And they were all very, very loving people. It was almost and when I met them, which I did, eventually one thing led to another. Um, when I met them, I felt like I had found my people, because I am very different looking than my mother's side of the family. I mean, we do look like each other, but the dark skin, the dark circles under the eyes, I had the hair, uh, that comes from the Sephardic Jew and the Middle Eastern. My father was born in Basra, Iraq,
Hmm.
which I did not know because my mother always told me he was born in Egypt.
Hmm.
No, yeah, she got a couple of things mixed up, but I met him because I wrote him a letter after the gathering in April of 1985. Um, I said to my mother, I need my father's address. I need to write to him. She had kept in touch with him through the years. I already had two sons. I was already on my second marriage, and yeah, second marriage, and wasn't happily married because my second husband was possessive and violent, and I did not want to stay in that marriage. But um um
You were visiting your dad.
so what happened was, yeah, thank you. What happened was, I wrote my father a letter, and my mom had been in touch with him, and she'd also seen him in Israel. She'd gone back, and she had let him listen to a tape of me singing, because I was a songwriter already and played guitar. And he asked her to leave the tape, and she said, no, if you want to meet Nomi, you need to come to America. And so she didn't give him my tape, my music. He was married now, no other children, and his only marriage. And so help me, I'm trying.
So you said that he didn't have any kids, and so
Yes,
that's
yeah,
how you wrote him a letter and you
yeah,
actually
wrote him.
ended up
Okay,
meeting.
so I wrote him this letter, and I didn't hear anything, nothing. And my mom said, don't worry, I mean, you were just an arrangement, don't expect anything. And 6 months go by, and the phone rings at 3 in the morning, and my husband goes and answers the phone. He comes back and he goes, it's for you. Didn't tell me anything. And when I went to the phone, first thing I heard, and the first time in my life that anyone ever claimed me, said, Nomi, this is your father. And I cannot express to you what that felt like
Wow.
to, for someone to say, this is your father, because I never had a father and never had grandparents or siblings. My family was very small. And what's going on right now in Palestine is heartbreaking. You hear of all these Palestinians that are losing family members, 20 family members, 100 family members. It makes a difference in your life when your family is killed or, taken from you, and you grow up without knowing the association and the relationships. I never knew what it was like to have a father and or siblings or grandparents. And, my heart breaks for these poor people in Palestine that are losing, their lives, and their families are being destroyed. Anyway, so when my father said, Nomi, this is your father, it was, my heart just skipped a beat. And
Wow.
and the first thing he said to me, are you happy? Just like my mother had said, he'd said to her. And I said, yes, I'm happy you've called me. And so he and I talked for maybe 20 minutes and 15, and he spoke English, and he was calling me from Israel. And um, we made arrangements. I said, would you come here to America to visit me and meet your grandkids? And he said, yes. So we made an arrangement. He very quickly got on a plane.
Oh,
It was
wow.
just a few weeks. Yeah, a few weeks later. And that's when he picked up the phone in my kitchen. He called his sister, my Aunt Samra, and in Utah, in Salt Lake City, and said, I'd like to come with my daughter. And that's when everyone learned that he had a daughter.
Wow. So, did you continue a relationship with him until he passed away?
No, it's very short term. He came, he spent about 3 weeks in my home. And, a father does not a parent make. He was my biological father, but he wasn't emotionally. Yes, it was a very wonderful experience. And he saw my mother again, and we had trips. We went to San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco at the time. Went to the Cliff House. We went to Half Moon Bay, which is close by me now. Um, but he, uh, no, it was not a healthy, it was a very emotional time. Um, but there were certain things he did that were inappropriate. And I don't want to talk about it, but he uh, didn't look at me as his daughter, but more of a woman of
Okay.
31. And so when and he also started to preach to me about staying married, because he was a very religious man, and it was against the rules to get a divorce. But I told him, you don't understand, and it's not, you really don't have a right to tell me that because I was at the beginning of this of wanting a divorce, or so. It was not healthy for me to be in that relationship, my second marriage. And that was going to happen next. That soon, it was going to happen
Yeah.
soon. And he was trying to help me save my marriage. But when he left, he went to England to visit his sister Shirley. And I was excited. I got her address. I wrote her a letter. She didn't answer me. 6 months or more go by, and I didn't hear anything from my father. And one day I got a phone call, and she identified herself and she apologized. She said that my father forbid her to have any contact with me. So
Wow.
what he was angry about was maybe my standing up for myself.
Yeah.
And that was the end of it. And I never, ever heard from him again.
That must be
And
very, I mean, even now though, didn't that feel like another abandonment to you?
mhm,
Hmm.
yeah, Yeah. This has been a nice therapy session.
Well, I was
Just
gonna
kidding.
say, I mean,
Just
how do
kidding.
you, like for you now, I mean, being a child, first of all, of a Holocaust survivor, which is a heavy thing to bear. And then, because I would feel, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are the daughter of someone who survived, especially someone you look up to, like your mom, um, like she was also human, so she would make mistakes, even parenting you. So I'm sure it's really hard to balance. Okay, my mom was a hero in the sense of like she lived for this really terrible thing and came out of it and was strong, and that is something to look at, but at the same time, she was flawed. And so how do you kind of compare that in your mind? Is that difficult to present a picture of both of those things, or does she have to be one or the other? How does it work for you and when you're talking to others and
I think of her as a hero.
okay.
I don't blame her for anything. I don't. I mean, she was hard on me, but I've never held this against her because I have this empathy for her. You know, what
Yeah.
she went through. I mean, yeah, no, she was flawed, and she often would disappoint me, but I disappointed her too because I wanted to have my own life. And that was hard because it was just me and my mom, growing up. And yet I couldn't wait to create my own life.
Yeah.
And when I started doing that, it was hard for her, but she took her life and decided to travel. She didn't feel sorry for herself. She went and did a lot of traveling. But now that I live in this house alone, because my kids are grown and they have their families, and we had COVID and the isolation, I think about my mom a lot and how hard it was. And, you know, you never stop being a parent, you never stop caring. Because I became a parent, my kids, left the house, they started their lives, and they're very content. But I try very hard to be a part of their life because we had it's a small family. Family to me is everything. It's the most
Yeah.
important thing, and it's always been that way. That's not a new thing. Family has always been very important, and I just but people can only do the best that they can under the circumstances in which they survive. And everything that they are and have become are because of all the circumstances they've endured. And I don't hold anything against my mom. I just think of her. I know that she was flawed, but it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter. I'm a strong person. I know that I am a strong person, but my mother was 100 times stronger than me.
Yeah.
I don't think of myself as I don't think of myself as a strong person, but people tell me that I am. Um, and I go, okay, but I just take things for what they are and do the best I can to cope with everything, that I've been through, because I've been through some things. So,
How
but I
about when
just
you think of your
adored her.
dad? Is it hard when you think about your dad, your biological dad?
I only knew him for basically 3 weeks. And what you don't know, you can't miss.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah.
I, as an only child, when I was in college, I did a paper on only children.
Yeah.
And one thing I learned in doing the paper was that when you don't have what you need or hope to have in your life, you find surrogates in life. And I did. There were people in my life that took on the role. They were lovely people. They weren't I didn't they weren't people that like a father would take you to, escort you or to your first prom or nothing like that. But I sort of, had an idea of what it was like to have a father, but
Yeah.
not really, but it doesn't matter. You can't grieve over circumstances you cannot control in life. and you can't hold anybody responsible. People cope with the deck that they're dealt, and you just that makes you, that makes you who you are. So
Do you think you've dealt with all of this well?
I do. I do think I have dealt with a lot well. I haven't made the best choices, maybe, 2 marriages, 2 divorces. But it's okay. Yeah. I have
What
2
it,
beautiful children, and my sons are amazing people. And my
yeah,
family is amazing. My grandkids are amazing. My daughters-in-law are amazing people. I feel blessed, you know. It's okay.
just to, I want to be respectful of your time because we've gone a little over actually, but um, I do want to ask one last question. What do you think is the most important thing to remember or to hold on to when people are studying or learning about the Holocaust and the people behind it? Um, the survivors, those who perpetrated the violence against the Jews. What do you think is really important for people to remember as they're researching and diving into the subject?
Uh, the effects of uh, Hitler and dictators, how, ruthless individuals can change your world and the world. And it's very important that uh, people understand the humanity of everyone that suffers. And try to not, have opinions about people, but instead understand the way to understand a person is to understand their history. It's very important to not be judgmental uh, of somebody, you know, and intolerant, or to have empathy and to have love, and that is the most important thing. Love. um yeah, it's a hard question to answer because I'm kind of long-winded. And you know it's not gonna. I mean, that was a question. What do I don't know if I've answered that for you appropriately or not, but just people have to have love. If people could not be judgmental or expect others to live their lives according to the rules that you think someone else should live by. I mean, we're all sisters and brothers on this planet, and we all have to learn to get along and learn to appreciate each other and our differences, what we bring to the table. The world could be a beautiful place if that could happen. But there are people, in power, Putin, who wants to continue to invade Ukraine and take it back. And he has no right to do that. And the Syrian people, how they've suffered, and the Palestinian people, they've suffered. In 1948, they were promised land that they never got, and this is where that all stems from. Um, you know, and Netanyahu, he's too much. He's too much. He's lost humanity, and um, everyone needs everyone wants to be a success. Everyone. Nobody wants to be a, a criminal, to go out on the street and shoot somebody, or or raid a store. They don't want that. People want to be successful. And but there's too much of a gap, there's too much of a gradient between those that have and those that don't. And that's unfortunately the way this world has gone. It's a frightening world now. I don't know if I answered your question,
No, no,
but
you
the
did.
whole
I think the main point you're saying is that the important thing to remember almost is that um if I'm saying what you're saying correctly, in order for the world to succeed and be a fruitful and safe place is for people to have empathy and understanding for one another. And that's
and
something that you
respect.
learn from the Holocaust, basically.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah, and respect for each other. Um,
Yeah.
and if Netanyahu doesn't want to give up any land, well, he might just have to do that. I mean, the land in Israel. I'm pro-Israel, believe me. But the land in Israel was voted on in Palestine to be given to Israel with the understanding that a portion of it would be given to Palestinians, and that has not happened. Yeah, they live in the Gaza Strip, but that isn't their land, and so you know this is what they're fighting for, and I understand that, and I think that there needs to be some changes, and Netanyahu needs to step aside, but it's the thing about Israel, the thing about that people don't understand is that Jews in the Holocaust were not, they didn't have weapons. If they'd had weapons to defend themselves, things might have gone differently. They would have had something to defend themselves with. And this kind of mentality, the the consequences of the Holocaust is why Israel stands and is as they may seem, you know, too hard, but this is why they're like this. And they will not give up that land. I'm sure of it. But this is why Israelis are the way they are because of their history. That they basically almost were disseminated, and if that's the right word, just genocide. And yeah, so
Yeah.
but
Well,
but
no,
but we can all live on this planet together if we just try to be kind to each other.
yeah. Well, Nomi, I really appreciate your thoughts, especially talking about your mom again. I know it's difficult to rehash her history and to share it with others and to share your thoughts. Um, and also, your boldness and confidence in being able to talk about it with me. But I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope that people can learn something